This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week, Dalia and I will be talking about literature and research and ideas and other things that are of interest to us and hopefully to you. Our guests today are authors of two new books that focus on the legal and political implications of emergency law provisions. Dr. Karin Loevy is a legal scholar at New York University and the author of the new book, Emergencies in Public Law, The Legal Politics of Containment, that was published recently by Cambridge University Press. And Dr. Yoav Mehozay is of the School of Criminology at the University of Haifa, whose new book, Between the Rule of Law and States of Emergency, the Fluid Jurisprudence of the Israeli Regime, has just been published by State University of New York Press. We've decided to invite you both for a joint discussion because your books are slightly overlapping and we're going to find out exactly how. So Dr. Karin Loevy and Dr. Yoav Mehozay, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just by way of introduction, Karin, how would you define emergency for the purposes of your inquiry?
Right. For my purposes, emergencies, I use a very, very broad definition. Emergencies are generally any threatening and unexpected events. The problem, though, is that it really doesn't matter much because the issue of definition itself is a big issue of emergency management, legal emergency management. So there's a lot of attempts to describe, define emergencies, and this is what affects the politics, much of the politics, the legal politics.
Is it an exception in the legal realm that something is so elusively defined? You know, my perception of legal people is that everything is really inscribed to the letter.
Yeah.
Although we know law has plenty of room for interpretation or we wouldn't need
Sure,
judges.
but something as broad as that, is it an exception?
Right. So you can say that under the traditional understanding of emergency powers, there is actually a notion that emergencies are particularly and inherently hard to define. And so this is one of the blocking elements of this field because people think, and this is part of the doctrine, it's part of the way people think about this field, they think that emergencies are so very, very difficult and impossible to define, of course, in advance, but also generally very hard to define emergencies, then they tend to say, oh, so there must be someone who will define. All we can do is authorize someone to define. And what happens is that there are many, many questions that are really important about definitions of emergencies that become blurred, or people just don't answer them because the answer is so easy. Just have someone decide. This doesn't give you a real answer. You still need to know what emergencies are. You need to know how to identify emergencies. You need to know who identifies emergencies and who contests the identification and where, and what are the resources that law allows you in order to make such contestations. These are really important questions that are blurred and hidden because of this kind of doctrinal understanding of emergencies as something very, very hard to define.
I'm going to ask a question of Yoav, but actually it's something you can start and maybe both of you could really answer because both of your books deal ultimately with how the law in a state responds to emergencies. And you're dealing with the theoretical question and you look at a number of different cases, Karin.
You, Karin.
Right. You, Karin, many different cases, including Israel. And Yoav, you focus specifically on Israel. But what I think you both have in common, and again, I'll start with Yoav, but you can both answer. Why are we wrong? I think in both of your books, you basically argue that it's not really accurate to look at legal responses to the state of emergency as if it's an exceptional, temporary thing. You argue, Yoav, that in Israel, it's actually an ongoing state of affairs. Karin, you argue that the structures in place are constantly working, or this is maybe the sort of realization of the powers of those structures. Why are we wrong to look at legal responses to the state of emergency as temporary exceptions, but actually the norm?
Well, I think we are wrong on two levels. One is empirical, that historically, and not only in Israel, and this actually goes back to your previous question, the same way that it's very, very difficult to define emergency, it's also very, very difficult to define the moment that emergency is over, that we are back to normal times. And
that's
often,
a very interesting point. That we don't...
And often, too often, emergency just sort of drags on. It remains in the law books for, many, many reasons. One is that nobody actually defines it now it's over. Sometimes the use of emergency is so vast, so it's actually something that administration of the state depends on these types of regulations. This is something that I share in the book.
And in Israel's case, they don't know an alternative scenario. So, in Israel, we've had a state of emergency since before the creation of the state. This is something that we...
So, in Israel, actually, it's a very, 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 very long duration. But once they actually decided to contain the emergency, it took them an enormous duration to actually come up with the last law, the terror bill, and still it did not cover all the mandatory regulation. And the mandatory regulation, some of them are still in place because if you just revoke them, there's going to be a legal gap.
Just to clarify for our listeners, you're talking about the terror bill that was proposed and enacted in order to replace earlier emergency legislation that had been in place since the beginning of the state, and even before.
It was imposed by the British, right?
So, well, what I think it would be very, very interesting to the listeners to know that the same emergency mechanism, the mandatory emergency defense regulations, were used against the Jewish instruments. So Etzel and Lehi and also Agana were all targeted by it. And
Begin famously said that they are worse than the Nazi laws, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So ever since...
He's not the only one that said they're worse than the Nazis.
So,
or potentially our new ambassador.
So ever since the inception of the state, there's been an attempt to replace them, revoke them, and replace them with a new original bill. And only in 2016 did it happen, and also not completely. So some of them are still here, and in the occupied territories, there are still, all of them are still in power.
I mean, I think there's also a more theoretical reason and general reason why we shouldn't...
That was my second point, which...
Sorry. Do you want to go on?
No, please.
Probably it's a little different than mine. For not going on, I'm trying to go against this notion of emergencies as exceptions and emergencies as real moments in which something terrible happens. And this is that there actually is a very, very big gap between this description of emergencies as this moment of extreme liminal situation,
out of time,
paradoxical situation, and the reality of legal and institutional practices everywhere in the world. Israel is an example, but it's true everywhere in the world, really, and in international legal structures, transnational legal structures. Instead of them focusing on one moment, they're actually, what you see is an extreme development on all fields: institutional development, legal development, more doctrines, more regulations, more protocol, more institutions that deal with threat everywhere. So what you see is this mobilization, this production, productivity, and you don't see law ending, law at its limit, laws being suspended. No, what you see is a lot of activity
that influences society in the future. That continues to influence society.
That's the other aspect, that you see these developments, this growth happening on a long-term process rather than in one moment. And so you have to somehow capture this in theory and in describing the phenomenon.
So you're saying it's no small thing to categorize something as an emergency. It's not just a philosophical question. If we categorize something as an emergency and then develop the legal response to it, that legal response bleeds into a permanent reality and legitimizes those kinds of laws. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I even say something more, I guess, dramatic. I say that even saying that it is bleeding is a little bit going back to this dichotomy, as if there is some kind of ground which is, really good, it's really law, and then there's something that's bleeding into it. That's a fiction that we need to move away from. There's nothing bleeding. It's a process of becoming politically and knowing how to handle threats and developing the tools to handle threats.
Okay, so now the obvious question comes to mind. What does it say about democracy? I mean, the fact that doesn't it really tilt the very delicate balance of the rule of law, of the checks and balances? I mean, doesn't it open the door to abuse of power?
Precisely. First, I think we need to distinguish democracy between the rule of law. I think democracy and the rule of law are two separate things, and we often confuse them. So I think
how so?
So the democracy, basic democracy is the rule of law and popular sovereignty. In this case, if the majority wants it, you can have it. Whereas the rule of law sets rules and principles that sometimes limit the will of the majority.
Sure, you can have rule of law in an autocracy, of course.
No, but I'm
It's not
talking
one
really
of the
about the checks and balances. I mean, it's such a delicate situation that, and if you really open the door to one arm of government, giving them a carte blanche to do whatever they want, it really could potentially have disastrous effects on the whole system.
Well,
maybe I'll put
disaster,
it in
some people would deem it something that is actually positive, and the other would consider it a disaster.
But even more than that, think about it. I mean, really handling emergencies, this idea that what happens is a concentration of power in one branch, that's the executive, and probably the president makes the decision, is again such a fiction, because if you look at a real situation of handling crisis, any kind, what you see is a variety of actors being involved. Even if a president wants to seem like he's holding, or a prime minister or something, or a government wants to seem like they're very tough and they're holding all the power, it's just not true. They have their advisors, they have their legal advisors. There's such bureaucracy is such a growing and living thing that you can't. There's nothing useful in understanding the problem of this field as a problem of concentration of power in one powerful agent. It doesn't help.
But I think the way I understood the question is to separate it from crisis. That the use of emergency is done outside of a real crisis. When there is a tsunami, just run for the hills. You don't need law.
I'm not talking about really the positive effects of using it. Of course, every now and again, there's. We could see such justification for it, but I'm more concerned about the potential abusive powers.
Although it sounds like, in fact, when you think about the states of emergency, that it could go in either way. I mean, that the law can be used either to enable positive behavior or constrain, abusive legal practices too. Or abusive executive practices.
But definitely, it's usually the executive branch, which is, I totally agree with Karin, something that is not just one person, but a vast operation that wants to maintain and actually expand its power, and this is done through various mechanisms. But emergency, I think, is one of the most effective one. You get to maintain some kind of affinity with the law, that is, you are legitimate, and then you get to exercise your power really without constraint and without any type of review.
But in a way, then you're saying the law becomes a fig leaf. You're saying that, in fact, the executive has lots of power, probably abuses it. The legal authorities and the legal interpretation ultimately justifies it and becomes a partner in it.
I actually say that. I think that what I try to show in the book, usually we think that it is the emergency that extends law. And what I show in the book is actually that sometimes law extends the emergency. Think about the way we administrate Jewish settlers. Okay? We have one...
In the West Bank.
Yes, in the West Bank. We have one emergency mechanism, that is international law, and we use this mechanism, the ability of the sovereign, the military commander, to issue decrees to actually insert more law, this state law, regular law, normative law, just to administrate life for Jewish settlers. And so you have a sphere that you can blow into it more law, and you actually make it bigger.
But isn't that because of the special status of the West Bank within the Israeli sovereign entity? I mean, if we're taking
it's not within the Israeli sovereign entity.
Exactly. No, but it's actually separate from the legal body of what constitutes.
Or let me ask you to define it. We actually have 3 systems of law between the river and the sea. Is that correct?
Definitely.
You have to say it.
But what I want to know now is how it affects us within the constitutional, pseudo-constitutional democracy that is Israel proper, leaving the West Bank aside for a second. If really emergency is part and parcel of every legal system, including the Israeli one, and here, in this case, it's really more flagrant than others, how does it affect us as full-fledged citizens of the Israeli democracy?
Just think about the summer of 2011. People went to the streets.
The big protest movement, yeah.
And they were protesting about a whole cluster of things. The mere legal mechanism that allows those abusive things that people were, taking out to the streets against, were not discussed. And this is Chok HaEsderim, adjacent to the budget law. When it first came out, it was an emergency regulation. It's still not democratic to this day. It's a different kind of being.
Can you say briefly what it is for our listeners? I mean, it's something that even Israelis aren't fully aware of.
In 1985, there was a unity government. That is that Labour, Ma'arach, and the Likud were sitting together and running the state. And during that time, because the Ma'arach was part of the government, the Histadrut, so civil society, the biggest institute in civil society, was also part of
the
this
labor
country's biggest labor union.
There was no opposition, and still, in order to issue this recovery plan, which totally neoliberalized Israeli economy, they used an emergency mechanism. So there's no opposition, not inside the Knesset, not inside civil society, but still, to make it more easy and more effective, they actually issued an emergency mechanism.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? So maybe the answer to your question is that the way it affects us is that this is the toolbox we are used to and we live comfortably with for many, many different reasons. But first of all, used to. And it is a fact of any crisis management, social science studies, that everybody knows that the tools that are there, that are in the everyday life of a society, of a community, will be probably used when they are needed in many senses. So it is the fact that we have it, that we're going to use it again, and it has an effect on our culture, on the legal culture. It has an effect on our political culture.
But what about when it's used for causes that might be a little bit different from the ones we're talking about? We've been looking at states of emergency in this conversation up until now, and the laws as something that injects, problematic elements that are, trespassing on our democratic freedoms and permanent parts of our lives. But what about those kinds of legal responses to natural disasters? What about the legal responses in Germany when they had to implement the welcome doors, welcome refugees policy? I mean, they had to put a legal structure in place as well. Will those possibly have more positive ramifications in the long term for society?
When you say those, you mean those that are not connected to military or security in the traditional sense.
Right. So not responding to a traditional military threat by which we use the law to constrain democratic freedoms, but where we use the law to enable.
Yeah, so I'll say two things about that. First of all, there is a history of moving between different types of crisis. If there's one type of crisis, it usually develops into another. It could be a war that then creates a humanitarian crisis, and then creates a natural disaster because of or a medical disaster because of this. the way crisis works. It moves between. So it's not. It's very hard to say, okay, these kind of crisis management activities are more helpful. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't make that distinction. That the other thing is that, of course, there are better ways and worse ways to handle crisis. This is the whole thing. We, as a society, have to develop our abilities, our capabilities, and certain institutions that are not necessarily those that we think about automatically, like the executive, the government, the military, also must develop their capabilities. And this is something that I think is, again, blurred, hidden because of the way we think about emergencies as this moment of threat.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to your question, I think you're totally right. I think it boils down to the political project. In both of our books, we politicize emergency. And again, as I said, I show that sometimes law is part of the dynamics that is responsible for actually abusing the rule of law. And so it boils down to the political project. If it's a political project about solidarity, if it's a political project about inclusion, so law will be used for that purpose. Okay? And here I will be the first that I wouldn't mind if there will be some shortcuts.
Shortcuts to what? Wait, shortcuts to what?
Shortcuts to the law, to the rule of law.
Basically, it's cutting corners. That's what it does to us. But
if it was
I'm
put
asking you... Yeah, I just like to ask you now. We are in 2017. Can we really talk about a political project of solidarity, of inclusiveness after 2016 when we saw all around the world, whether it was in the European Union, whether it was in the United States, a movement in the absolute opposite?
Definitely, this is what we need. And I think part of what we saw in 2016 is the aftermath of years and years without solidarity with other political projects, of exclusion.
But emergency works both ways. And if it's a function of the political project,
law,
the political project
law
we see now...
works both ways. And what I'm trying to say is that I'm not here to protect law. Okay?
You're here to argue for a better political project.
That's it. I know that law will always serve a political project. Mm-hmm. If we need to talk about...
Well, that makes it seem like it's not really a check and balance, but that it's subsumed to the actual political project.
Checks and balance, from what I said, checks and balance is actually a very good tool to actually balance power.
If it was for real. But you're saying that law is usually put to the service of the executive in some way.
Sometimes.
Okay, Karin.
So there is something that is, you could say, inherent in the project of constitutional democracy, which still is around. Of course, there are different attempts to destroy it and forget about it forever. And it is in itself a project of legality. And it's hard sometimes to see it, and sometimes it's really abused in many, many ways because of the compulsion that law has to be used for everything else, for every political agenda that you might have. But law in itself, because of this compulsion, also has the ability to become a project in itself. If you think about our officials, they are supposed to be committed to law. And what does that mean? If this is a rule of law state, which all states are supposed to be in the world now, what are they supposed to be committed to a political project or to the project of realizing law in the sense of realizing the rule of law, realizing ideas of equality that are inherent in law, realizing human rights. So there is at least one strand of thinking about emergencies, which is the legality model. It's part of the tradition of thinking about Western, in the Western tradition of legal and political theory, is thinking about law as a project in itself. And I think it exists there somewhere also under layers and layers of illusions of making law, of using law for other purposes.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, we have answer and then we'll have the next question.
I think this might be the place that Karin and I disagree. Well, I think it has to be with Karin. She's a legal scholar. This is the way she was brought up intellectually. And I'm not as committed to law. Don't get me wrong. The values, human rights are values that I cherish. But I think that they are not part of any type of natural law that is without power to ensure that they will be executed. They are just hanging out in the air.
So you're a Hobbesian, basically.
There are legalists who are Hobbesian too. So I'd say the idea is to connect.
Guy, but
we take our rent, guys. Too.
The idea of the legality model is to connect law and power. So it's not to overlook the connection between politics and power. Is to acknowledge that law itself has this. First of all, a moral aspect that is very strong, and second, the ability to create a distinction that is very political between what is legal and what is illegal, and then create and then pull itself up. So
well, this is a great segue. This is a great
ability
segue.
to do it takes power.
Mm-hmm. That's power. That's how power is created, by making that distinction. Exactly.
Well, that is why they say the definition of the state is the entity with a legitimate monopoly on the use of force. This is a great segue to my last question, which really ties into what you were saying, but it's something I think both of you can answer. What to do, or can we sometimes consider that a state of emergency what happens when the state of emergency, or when the emergency comes from the executive itself? And I'm thinking, you must have realized what I'm thinking. I'm thinking of what's been going on in the U.S. since last weekend, where you have the executive creating an executive order, and the legal system, including those who were politically appointed by Republicans, basically blocking that executive order, not using the term state of emergency, not using extraordinary laws, but in a way doing exactly what a check and balance is supposed to do in a democracy. Can you speak to that? Is there such a thing as a state of emergency where the executive is the state of emergency?
That's a fascinating question, and it's hard to say at the moment if what's going on exactly there.
There's really no precedent.
Need some time.
For that, right?
No precedent for this president.
I'm sure there are precedents
unprecedented
for this president. But one thing you could say is, if we started by talking about definition and the need to have the ability to identify threats, not held only in that concentrated place in the executive. Sometimes someone would need to identify a terrible threat to the constitution or to the political consensus in the executive itself. That's part of this tradition, actually. Mm-hmm. So who would that be? Do we have institutional capacities? Who would have institutional capacities or non-institutional? What would be the normative basis on which we identify these kind of threats? What would be the relevant standards in which we would see? But of course, someone needs to point to these activities and say, look, he's saying he's doing it legally. He's saying he has authority to do terrible things. But actually what happens here is a destruction.
Mm-hmm. But Yoav, based on what you've learned from your book, you might say, well, when the executive wants to, the executive co-opts the legal system.
Sometimes, but then
Does that make you pessimistic about what's happening in the U.S.?
Yes and no. But what you just described, it's remarkable. What you see is individuals who are actually acting politically. They're using their symbolic power, as, legal agent.
You mean the courts in the U.S.?
Yes. But what they are actually doing is a political action and saying, no, not here.
Even though some of them come from his political party?
Even though some of them...
Do you agree that it's political action, or is it pure
actually,
implementation
of the law? I don't think he has a power.
One of them. One of the judges.
Yeah, but Trump doesn't have a party. He's his own
party.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Karin, would you agree that this is a politicized act on the part of the judges, or that it's actual pure implementation of law regardless of political leaning?
As I said, I don't think there's such a distinction. I think law and politics coincide all the time. They must coincide. But just to say one last thing about it, the American system is so centered on executive acting in emergencies, and that is in a way blocks some of it, the ability to respond to such a threat. Yeah.
Well, the current Trump presidency is unprecedented in so many ways, so it remains to be seen. But on this, we'll have to wrap up. Dr. Karin Loevy, a legal scholar at New York University and the author of Emergencies in Public Law, The Legal Politics of Containment, as well as Dr. Yoav Mehozay of the School of Criminology at the University of Haifa, author of Between the Rule of Law and States of Emergency, the Fluid Jurisprudence of the Israeli Regime. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. And also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, double, triple, quadruple thanks today, Tammy, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. We hope you listen to every single one of them. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Also follow me and myself and Gilad on Twitter separately. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.